So now we are going to work on our routing. So as you can see right now, I do not have any route set up here. So what I want to do here, I'm going to import the router module to my imports array, and then I want to attach that routes constant to this router module, and then I'm going to export the router module as well. So right now it's giving me error, but don't worry about that. I'm going to import this router module, and I'm going to declare these routes here. So let's do that. So I'm going to define a constant routes, which is going to be of type routes, and let me import routes and router module here. So now this error is gone. So next thing is, like, I need to include all of my routes. So I have pages like, you saw headers.component.html. I do not see a reason why anybody anywhere from my application I'm going to call header.component or footer.component. So that is the reason I do not want to declare those in my routes array, because those will not be directly accessed. Those are just part of the main application. The routes I will be having is like about us, attendance page, settings page, login page, and sign up. So let's just start including those one by one. Okay. Next thing is I'm going to import the about us component, login component, sign up component, and attendance component. Okay. I'm also going to include the AuthGuard service. So what AuthGuard service is going to do is going to protect the routes. So right now I do not need any protection on the about us, login, or sign up component. Protection, what I mean is, like, suppose the user is already signed in, or even his user is not signed in, the user should be able to route to this component. And you will see, once you see that in action, you will understand what I mean. But when it's come to the attendance.component, definitely if the user is logged in, then only you want user to access that component. So what AuthGuard service is going to do is going to control that behavior. Let me just finish up this routing here. Then next thing is we are going to code our AuthGuard service, and you will understand a little better how I am securing that. Okay, now to my routes array. Uh, uh, so first thing I want to include a blank. So by default, whenever somebody goes to localhost 4200, let me show you this. So the first page I want to open, that's going to be about us page. And for my application, this makes sense. You need to have some kind of a dashboard or a starting introduction kind of a page where user can go and first land into that page. Okay. Next thing is I want to do, I want to include the about us, and then login, sign up, attendance. Okay, so I'm done here, but as I said earlier, for the attendance page I want to protect that route. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to so to this path variable, I'm going to pass the can activate here, and inside the can activate, I'm going to include my AuthGuard service here. So this is done. So as you can see, my app.routing module, everything, I have covered all the routes, and here I am only protecting the attendance route. Let me show you what that means. So let's go to the AuthGuard service here. Okay, now AuthGuard service, as you can see, this is very blank. There is nothing inside there. First thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to import the can activate and the router from the Angular router module. So what actually this is going to do, router, and you will see that in action. So can activate is the is going to help me secure if the component can be activated or not. So let's do that. I'm going to call the backend service here, and I'm going to use the backend service to write the code which is going to check if the user is authenticated or not. So anytime, I think it's a good idea, whenever you're making any connection to the database, please always use the backend service. Please write all the database specific code to one place. So in my case, I'm using backend service to write my database code. Okay. Next thing is, so I'm going to implement the can activate here. I'm going to call that backend service inside my constructor here, and it's going to be a private variable. Okay. Now it's giving me an error, as you can see, because can activate is not implemented correctly. So I need to implement that can activate method. But before I do that, so what happens if the user is not signed in? So what I want to do, I want to throw that user back to some other routes. So that's why I have included the router module into this one, and I'm declaring, I'm initiating router into a private variable called _router. Okay, now let me declare, now is the time to implement this can activate method here. So can activate, as you can see, is going to be an async method and is going to return a promise. So it's going to promise is going to be a boolean. That means, like, you have access or you don't have access. It's a true or false. So inside that can activate, I'm going to declare a constant called authenticated user. What this authenticated user is going to do is going to call a function on my backend service is called get user. So don't worry about that get user because it's not defined yet. That's why it's giving you an error. And the function is giving me error because the promise is not, it's not returning anything. So these two error will go away in a minute. Next thing is I'm going to reuse this authenticated, okay, method here. Now if the user is not authenticated, so that means in that case you want this to use this router and you want this component, you want to throw that user back to the login page. So basically that's all pretty much it. So what expectation of this component is still going to make use of the get user function. Okay, so once we implement get user, you will understand what I mean. Now here is still giving me an error because this is expecting a promise in return. So now let's go and return an authenticated. Okay, so as you can see, this component looks good. The only error it's giving right now because the get user is not defined. So let's go work on our get user component. So I'm going to go back to my backend service here. So as you can see, there is nothing in there. Let me start importing a couple of modules to my backend service. So I'm going to include the Angular Fire auth. I'm going to include the Angular Fire store and Fire store document because I'm going to use this to get read and write data on the attendance or other collections on my Firebase. Okay. Next thing is I'm going to include the auth from Firebase app, and I'm going to import the environment variable. So remember, the environment variable is the variable where I have written all the database specific logic. So in this case, as you can see, my API keys and everything out there. Okay. Now let's go back here. Now I think I need to import one more thing. I need to import observable, couple of right now you don't see where I'm using it, but later on definitely I'm going to use observable here. So and I will also use a couple of the operators from RxJS. So in case if you don't know what RxJS is, it's a reactive implementation. Go to RxJS website. So like in Angular 7, I think even starting Angular 2, they have implemented the observable. Um, so I'm going to import couple of RxJS operators like switch, map, and take. There's a whole course on RxJS, but definitely this is a separate topic. I am not going to cover that here. So this assumes like you have a little bit fundamental understanding of RxJS observables here. Okay. Now I think now I'm done importing all the whatever I need, all the packages I need for this implementation. So now let's start working into constructor. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to include the initialize this Angular Fire auth. One thing you will notice, I have declared this as a public. So anytime you might have noticed in my, I always declare this as a private variable, but in this case I'm using this public. The only reason why I'm doing this so that I can use this AF auth inside anywhere in my application. So that's the reason. AF auth is the only exception in my opinion, or anywhere if you want to have some kind of if you intend to use that package publicly in anywhere application, always use the public. Otherwise it's always a private. So next thing I'm going to include the Angular Firestore. As you can see, is going to be a private underscore AFS because the only reason I declared is private because I do not want Angular Firestore to be accessible from any other component. So that's the reason I have included this as a private here. Okay. Now let's start working on our login. Okay. So I think in login, well, okay, I think I was supposed to work on the get user. So let's start working on our login.component for a second. Okay, I think since I'm already here and there are only a handful of functions, so let me just start working on the login. I'll come back to this. I know I haven't finished that get user here. But let me just let me cover the login, all the login and sign up kind of information. Sorry, login and sign up methods here. Then I will go to the get user. But in case if you're wondering where I'm getting all this from, so I just want to quickly show you that if you ever need any help on this, so go to the GitHub repository of Angular Fire 2, and you will find all. This is the official Angular repository, and this is where you can see which you can refer for all the documentation, and they have the code samples and everything. So you don't need to you might be wondering, there's so many complex stuff or things like that, but you know what, they have very good implementation out there, and their documentation is very, very good. So as you can see, if you go to that getting started with Firebase authentication, you will see that how they have implemented the authentication. So what I am using is very, very similar implementation what they have already done, but there's a little bit changes in my application. So for example, in login, as you can see, they are using this .afauth.auth that sign in with pop. So I'm going to use a similar method, but not exactly this one, and I'll tell you the reason why. So let's go back to our application for 1 minute. I want to quickly show you how my login page looks like. Okay, let's go to login. Okay, while we are waiting, so let me just in login page. Okay, you can see I'm providing two different methods the user can use to log in. One is through email and password, and other is through Firebase social authentication, that you use Facebook or Google. Now how do I know that which method user is using to log in? So what I'm going to do in my login.component.html file, so I will call the different methods based on what which method user is using to log in. So for example, in login application, I am just declare a private a parameter here, so it says login type. So login type could be a social auth, or login type could be email or password. There are two different ways user can log in. So let's go back to this one, and then the form data. So suppose user is using the form to log in, that means the email ID and password. So this is an optional. So in that case, user is going to pass the form data variable here. Okay. Now form data is going to include the email and the password. So if the form data is there, then in that case I want to return this method, which is afauth.auth, then sign in with email and password, and I'm going to pass the email and password. So again, go back to the repository, GitHub repository and Angular Fire 2. You will see that this is the method they are using for the afauth. So I'm using a different, not different, but very much similar implementation, but I'm using the method for which is used for the sign in with email and password. So very similar implementation. The methods are a little bit different, and once you if you want to know what other methods are available, just put your cursor in, and it will show you the number of methods are available there. Next thing is, if the form data is not passed in, so that means in that case user is using the social login. So in that case, what I want to do inside the else statement, I'm going to say, and again inside the social auth there are two different options. One is user might be using Facebook, or user might be using Google. So in that case, if login method equals to Facebook, then call this declare a new instance of the of the auth variable of the auth package, which is called Facebook auth provider. Otherwise, if the login type equals to Google, then you use the Google auth provider, and then just very simply you call this method afauth.auth, and then you pass this login method here. So again, once you see the login page, you will understand how I'm passing the different types of sign up methods here. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it on this login type. Next thing is I want to do here. So this function will be used in this page, in this component. Okay. Next thing is, let's go start working on our redirect login. So what if the user click on Google and it is socially authenticated? So suppose it goes there and I pick up my Google account, and it comes back here. How do you want to handle that user is logged in or not? All you need to do is call this afauth and get redirect results. Okay. So that's pretty much it on the login and sign up thing. Now next thing is, I think we need to create a user. So what if the user is on the sign up page? So here, you know, obviously if you don't want like Google or Facebook here, that doesn't imply here. The only method I'm providing here, if you choose, okay, I'm not going to use a social authentication, I want to use my own email and password. So in that case, you can use this functionality here. So this page, this function I'm going to call from sign up component. So inside that create user, same thing, I'm going to say if environment.database equals to Firebase. This is an optional variable here. You don't need to do that. You can just directly return this method. But you know, I have a habit of like, you know, putting everything inside that, as you can see, environment variable. So that's why I have declared it. So again, you know, here very simple, afauth.auth, and you call this method called create user with email and ID and password. What this method is going to do, either is going to create that user, a new user, otherwise it will come back with an error saying you know what, email IDs already exist. So in either case, you know, once we start coding on sign up math component, you will understand, you know, how to handle that situation if the user IDs already exist. Okay. So that's pretty much it on the create user side. Next thing is, well, this is optional, as I said, you know, in case if you're using a MySQL or MongoDB database, then you just need to write that code here. Right now, as you can see, is blank. Okay, now I think now we can, you know, call this method called get user. So what get user does, it checks the authentication state. So again, you know, go back to that Angular state here, and it will tell you like, you know, so how to check the user is authenticated or not. Okay, so basically afr.auth state, and it's just going to, you know, again, the reason I'm using the pipe and these take operators here, because I just want to know the user is authenticated or not, yes or no. I do not want anything else from the Firebase server, so Firebase database, sorry. So that's I think that's pretty much it. That's all get user is doing. So now let's go back to that where I was using auth service. So I hope that error is gone now. So as you can see, my get user. So here, going back to this one, get user return a state which is up type boolean. It returns a promise. It says, okay, the user is authenticated, yes or no, and it returns a boolean value, and that's all this auth is going to consume. So my auth service part is done now. I'm going to close this file. I'm going to close the app routing module.ts file here. Now let's start working on I think login page. So sorry, I have, you know, already worked on the login function here in the backend because I wanted to finish all the backend methods here. So that's why I kind of like, you know, did it like this. And there are a couple of other functions for the attendance as well. So let me just copy paste so that this file, and I will cover this in later part once I start working on the attendance.component.ts file here. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. So my backend service looks good. Now let's go start working on our login.component.ts. So here, sorry, my app is recompiling. Okay, so in the login page, as you can see, there are two different ways you can, you know, as I already covered, two different ways, either using the email ID and password, or you use the social login. And within social, you have two different ways, either use a Facebook or Google. So it's going to be very simple. I'm going to first import the on init here and after view init. These two you know, libraries from the Angular core module here, and then I am going to include the Angular Fire Auth. I'm also going to include the environment variable, and the reason I'm including the environment variable, suppose you do not want the social authentication in your app. So all you need to do, go to this environment file here, and then, you know, you just switch it off. Say, okay, social auth equals to false. So that means, you know, these buttons will not show up. Okay. Next thing is I'm going to import the backend service. And let me implement the on init here. I think I also need to implement the after view init here. Right now, as you can see, my component is giving error because I have not implemented these two methods correctly. These two interfaces, like an on init and after view init. Okay, so I'm going to fix that later. But before I do that, let me just create a couple of variables here. Social auth, and you will see how I'm using this variable here. Error, data loading, broken network, sorry, So let me just what these four variables is going to do. You will see once I implement the login.component.html style, you will understand how I'm using these four different variables here. But basically, just to give you a hint, error is if there is an error, show that error. Data loading is I'm using this. If you click on that login button, I want to show a nice looking spinner or some kind of a bar. Let me show you that in action, so it will make more sense. So let's head out to material.angular.io component, and I want to show you uh, progress bar. So this is what I mean. So I want to show this bar, this bar, that okay, your app is actually doing something. Otherwise, your user will never know that he has clicked on the submit button. So that's what it's going to do. Whenever the data loading equals to true, my app is going to show this bar. So that's actually what I intend to do using this variable. Now, broken network, you can use any variable here. Broken network actually is not the network is broken. Suppose your app is having some error. So I would say, okay, it will I will hit it to true. Okay. Now, let me declare that AF auth here inside my constructor, and I'm going to include my backend service to my constructor as well. ng on init. So here I'm going to, as I mentioned earlier, this .social auth, that environment file. So again, go to the environment file. If you say social auth enabled equals to false, so social auth will be false. Otherwise, if it is true, then it's going to be true. Again, what social auth is going to do, if you want to include a social authentication, if you want this button to appear, you make it true, otherwise make it false. Okay. Now, let's go ng after view init. So in this view init, I'm going to, once you're authenticated, so Firebase will return you a couple of objects like UID, your name, or your photo, URL, all the Google or Facebook, authentication information like your email, phone. So Firebase knows, all the social authentication services, they know a lot about you. They know your email ID, your password, your name, even if you have a Google photo on your Gmail, it will show that to you here. Okay. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to say I'm going to subscribe to that DS user, and whatever the results comes in. So this AFR, that means in case of social authentication, is going to get your variable like UID, that's your unique ID here, and is going to save this to your local storage. This is totally optional. If you do not want to save to your local storage, don't do that. But just what your name is. So the good idea is once you see, if you click on login with Google, it knows your name already. So it will it's going to capture the display name and it's going to save it to your local storage. Again, you don't need to save this in your local storage, but just in case if you want to use that, you can always do that here. Okay. Now let's go this again. I'm going to repeat that this is totally entirely optional here. Now let's go implement the login method here. So as I mentioned earlier, I've already defined my login method here. Okay. Now here, what this login method is going to do. So the way I'm going to call this login, if the user click on this login button, or if user click on this login with Google, this button, I'm going to call this login method here. Again, it respects two parameters, login type and form data. Second one is optional. So then I'm going to call this method, this .backend service. I'm just going to call directly this method, which is login method, and I'm going to pass this login type and form data. Okay. Again, I think it's a good idea because this is this AF authentication is going to return some a promise here. In this case, a promise or an observable here. So here is a good idea to catch that if there is any error, and if there is any error, what you want to do, you want to catch that error. And then so here is the error, remember, so it's going to catch that error, and it's going to whatever the error comes from the Firebase is going to assign to this variable here. Last thing I want to do here, declare the logout method. And logout method, similarly, whatever you have set up in the local storage. So when user click on the logout, I think it's a good idea to remove everything. So basically, I'm going to remove everything from the local storage, and then very simply, you just say afr.auth.sign out. You're going to sign out. So that's pretty much it. So as you can see, if you go to the Angular Fire 2, and the way to sign out here, is this very simple method here. You don't need to do anything extra. So I think I'm done on the login.component.typescript file. Let's go to the login.component.html implementation. So as you can see, I'm starting with the blank file here. I'm going to include the app header. So again, first thing is like this is the app header. Okay. So remember we worked on our header.component.html file. So this is my header. So all I'm going to do here, I'm going to include that app header here. Okay. Now, but remember in header.component.ts, it expects two input variables here, in image URL and page title, and these are these icons and this page title. So let's go here, and I'm going to pass this page title equals to login, and I'm going to pass the image URL to dashboard. So again, dashboard is the icon here. So if you go to the login, let me go back to the login. See, this is the dashboard material icon. You can pass any icon you like. If I write, book, or there are tons of material icons there. Let me show you. So in case you're wondering where I got this icon from, these are not my icons. These are delivered from Google. So you go to this website material.io and you can pick any icon you want. So for example, say dashboard. See, this is the dashboard icon I want to include. So any icon you like. So for example, say new. So you see they have tons of icons there. So it's, feel free to use any of these things. Here I'm using the dashboard. Okay. So now my app header is done. Okay. Now next thing is I'm going to create a mat card. So after the material card, after this app header, I want to create a new card here, material card. So again, if you are wondering where it is coming from, so here you will see mat card examples, this thing. So you can just go ahead and copy paste any of the look and feel you want. Basically, it's very simple. So here I'm going to use this mat card, and inside the mat card I'm going to include a mat card header. Now so again, you need to have a design ready, at least in somewhere in your paper or in your mind, that you know how, or it could be an experimental step that you are coding and then you start working on this. So inside this mat card header, I'm going to include a title. So now whatever the title is, a static test here, so I'm not going to worry too much about this. Now after the mat card header, I want to include this form here. So I'm going to create a div, and div will say, okay, if they will say see afr.user, here I'm going to make user afr function here. So suppose the user is already signed in, then in that case you do not want to show any of this thing. You just want to show that, hey, you have already signed in, go to the profile page. So that's what it's going to do. It's going to say, okay, let's hide this entire form if the user is already signed in. So if not, then you need to create the so suppose the user is signed in, so you just say welcome user.display name, and then if optionally you can display the user photo as well, user picture. So remember, like I talked about the user photo URL, so you can include that user photo here, and it's going to display very nice looking little image of the user. Okay. Now I'm going to pick a break statement here, and then if the user is already logged in, I'm going to include a button which, if you click I'm giving an option to log out from there. Okay. Now this is how the user is going to log out. So this whole thing is if the user is already logged in. Now let's go if the user is not logged in. So in that case, show this ng template, which is show login. So all this form and everything I am going to code inside this ng template. So now let's start working on our form. Inside this ng template, I'm going to put a mat card content. I want to create a divider here, a nice line which separates the title from the form. And then I'm going to have a form. It's going to be a template driven form. So again, Angular provides you two different types of forms, template driven and reactive form. In this case, it's a very simple form, and that's why I'm going to use the template driven form. It's a simple form. So all you need to do, declare a temporary variable form data, and initialize this with the ng form here. Okay. Next thing is, when the form is submit, I'm going to call this login method here. So here again, as you can see, the login type is equals to email, and I'm going to pass the login form value here. So now So in this form, as you can see, I want to include an email field and password field, nothing fancy. Okay. So at call action, if there is any error, then you display the error here. Again, I want to include the data loading. I talked about that spinner thing. So I'm going to include that data loading. So if the user click on the submit button, so it's going to show that line, that is spinner I've shown you earlier. Okay. Next thing is I'm going to create that error. In case if there's an error, I want to display that some nice message saying okay, there is an error. Okay. Next thing is I'm going to create that button. As you can see, it's a very simple button. And it's disabled with the form data is not equals to valid. That means, as you can see, if the user don't put anything, is disabled, and the moment you put anything here, and if the form fields are valid, is going to be enabled here. Okay. Now let's include the actual email ID input element here. As you can see, very simple form. There's nothing into, but I want no special treatment here is been given to these fields. But I want to include an error here. So suppose if the user accidentally put a garbage email here, I want to display message saying, you know what, please enter a valid email here. So I'm going to put a mat error, and I'm going to call this if email is invalid, please enter a valid email. Same thing. Next thing is I'm going to include the password field here. Just like the email, I'm going to put some error for password as well. Okay. Again, you can copy paste this implementation. It's not like, I don't want, there's nothing, special about it. So that's why I'm just covering those things in it. I'm just copy pasting this code here because, I don't want to waste your time, writing each and every single piece of code. Okay. Next thing is, I think, so I want to include these two buttons here. So again, I could have said login with Facebook, login with Google, but I want to just make use of chips. And let me show you what these chips are. Chips. So as you can see, chips are very nice looking angular material buttons. So I just want to use a chip here. Okay. So again, I'm going to create two chips, one for Facebook and one for Google, and I will give them a different color, and each one I'm going to call a different method here. So login with Facebook, here I'm going to say login with Google, and I'm going to use a different variable, same method here, sorry, but passing the different arguments here. Okay. Last thing is, I think I'm going to include a link to that no account. That means that if the user is already doesn't have an account, he want to create a new one with the email ID and password. So this button is going to take the user to sign up page. So I'm going to include a button for no account, and is going to route it to the sign up component here. I think that's pretty much it. So my login.component.html file is ready. My login.component.typescript file is ready. I think that's all I need on the login side of it. So let me close this. Okay. So now let's fix our signup component.ts. So very similar to login page, this is going to be even simpler because here, as you can see, is very simple. It's just like it's email ID and password, and the user is logging in. So it's going to be very simple implementation. So just like the login, I'm going to implement an on init here, and then I'm going to include my backend service. I'm going to include the router here. Here. I'm going to include those default variables. Okay, and I'm going to call this function backend service here, router. So again, you can find all of this code to my GitHub repository. You don't need to, or if you want to code along, you can just pause the videos in different steps and start coding. So if the here what I want to do, still suppose user last minute user changes mind. He says, okay, you know what, I already have an account, so I want to route that user back to this login page. So basically that's why I created this function called router login page. It takes the user back to the login page. Okay. So, and then this component is going to use only one function, which is on submit function. So it takes the form data and it creates the user. So inside that, I'm going to call that create user. So remember, on the backend service I created that create user function here. So all I'm going to do here, I'm going to call that and then subscribe to that. Okay. So if the user is created, then is successful. Data loading equals to false. That means like it stops showing that progress bar here, and save changes equals to true. That means user is equals to same. So why I'm doing there, you will see that in a minute what save changes does. So once the user is already created, that you do not want to show this form. You want to show a message that hey, your user ID is created. Now, if the user ID is not created, then you want to show an error. So that's how I'm using these two variables here, error and saved changes here. So now, as you can see, if there is any error, then say still you need to stop that data loading data loading progress bar, and here you just say save changes equals to false. That means it still is going to show that form, but it will show an error, and what this error is going to be, the whatever the error is coming from the server. Okay, from the Firebase, I mean. So that's pretty much it on the signup.component.ts file. Let's start working on our signup.component.html. Similar to the login, first thing you will need, here is the app header. And inside the app header, this time I'm going to pass the title, say sign up, and the icon will be a new icon. So image URL equals to fiber new, and page title is going to be a sign up. Next thing is, so I'm going to use the variable called save changes. If save changes equals to false, then show the form. Otherwise, if the save changes equals to true, then show the that user ID is already created. So here, let's create that form again, like the login page. Very simple form here. So inside that form, I'm going to create first. Let me put a title here saying create account. And then I'm going to create a button, which again we talked about this. So like this button will still give an last minute option that hey, if you already have an account, go back to the login page. So, and in this button, as you can see, this is going to take that to user to the login page. So here, okay, if the error is there, so again that's how you handle the error, sorry, not error. Okay, if the user ID is already exists, that means if there is any error come from the server, then you want to display that user ID is already taken. I think it's a better idea, you should have displayed the error coming from the server itself, but this is just for the demo purpose, so I have included when the I've hard coded the error. Otherwise, it's always show the actual error coming from the database. Okay, now data loading, similar to the login page. When the user clicks on that submit button, I want to show that nice looking progress bar here, or any spinner icon. Okay, and if there is any network connection error, you want to show that. These things are optional, but it gives you a very professional look and feel to your app. So please, I highly recommend you showing this kind of progress spinner bar, or this kind of error messages here. So now let's create the form, and where is like the login form, create the button. I'm going to create these two fields here, very similar. And if the fields are like just put the nice validation here, very similar to the login button. It's a copy paste from that page only. Okay, next thing is, if the user is already signed in, user is already created, then you want to hide this form and show this instead. So that's what it's going to do, hide this entire form and show this method. So again, when this happens when the save changes equals to true. Okay, now here I'm just going to because it's a one line statement, so I'm just going to create some line breaks here. Inside the line break, I want to say user ID is created and please log back in, and I want to also create like some kind of a button here saying okay, user ID are already created, just close this, so it will take that user back to the login page here. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it on the signup.component.html file. So as you can see, most of my things are ready. So about us, I don't know if I covered this already or not, but again, this is a very static page. As you can see, no Angular about it. About us is only information only page. So as you can see, most of my pages are ready right now. Similar to this, same thing, attendance.component.html. Here actually you will see a couple of the the main logic here, but otherwise I think most of my infrastructure for the pages is ready now.